Welcome. Tonight, we drift into a warm, half-lit room in the city of Rosario, Argentina, where river air moves gently through open shutters and the low sounds of evening. Traffic mixed with distant laughter from a cafe down the street. The year is 1928, and somewhere inside this ordinary apartment, a newborn is wrapped in a blanket, breathing a little too fast, his chest fluttering with a rhythm that will follow him for the rest of his life. Most people wouldn't last a week in this fragile body, much less in the life that will grow out of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And wherever you're listening from tonight, feel free to leave your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928. To a middle-class family with deep roots in Argentina's tangled social history. His parents, Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna, were progressive, bookish, and quietly rebellious in their own ways. Their home was filled with novels, political pamphlets, chessboards, and conversations that wandered from poetry to social justice before dinner was finished. Even as a child, Ernesto was surrounded by ideas long before he ever learned to organize them. But before ideas, there was asthma. It arrived early and never truly left. Some nights young Ernesto lay awake gasping, the wheeze in his chest louder than the crickets outside his window. His mother often sat beside him, rubbing eucalyptus on his back, whispering stories to distract him from the tightness in his lungs. It is one of the well-known facts of his life that asthma shaped nearly everything he did. From his discipline to his stubborn refusal to accept physical limits. A little-known detail, remembered by family, friends, is that he kept a notebook as a boy where he rated each asthma attack by severity, as if trying to turn suffering into something orderly and understandable. The family moved often, chasing cleaner air and calmer climates, from Rosario to Buenos Aires, then to the mountain town of Alta Gracia in Córdoba province. The mountains offered him relief, but also isolation. While other boys played football, Ernesto sat under trees reading Jules Verne, Pablo Neruda, and Sigmund Freud. He taught himself chess openings and memorized entire poems. His father once said that Ernesto read more in 1 year than most adults read in a lifetime. Despite the asthma, he refused to live gently. He played rugby with fierce commitment, earning the nickname Fusa, short for El Furibando, the Furious One. Teammates remembered him tackling harder than anyone, even when he could barely breathe. There is something almost tender in that image, a thin, wheezing boy charging headfirst into life, determined not to let his lungs define him. Argentina in the 1930s and 40s was not a peaceful backdrop. Political coups, labor unrest, and deep class divisions shaped everyday life. The Guevara household leaned left, hosting Spanish Civil War refugees and discussing European fascism at the dinner table. Young Ernesto listened quietly, absorbing everything. Historians still argue whether these early political influences or his later travels mattered more in shaping his ideology. But the seeds were clearly planted here, among the bookshelves and heated conversations of his childhood home. He was also strangely affectionate. He wrote long letters to friends and family, even when living in the same town, practicing language as if preparing for something he could not yet see. His handwriting was messy, his spelling sometimes careless, but the emotion behind the words was steady and intense. By his teenage years, Ernesto had developed an unusual mix of tenderness and iron discipline. He cared deeply for his siblings, helped his mother around the house during his asthma attacks, and still found time to argue about philosophy with anyone willing to listen. When he finally left Alta Gracia for Buenos Aires to study medicine, he carried more than suitcases. He carried a private promise that his life would not be small, and that suffering, his own or anyone else's, should never be ignored. This quiet resolve, formed between mountain air, hospital visits, rugby fields, and library shelves, would follow him far beyond Argentina, into jungles and cities and history itself. By the time Ernesto settled into Buenos Aires in the late 1940s, the city felt like a living organism, cafes pulsing with debate, streetcars humming like distant insects, the Rio de la Plata carrying both fog and possibility. He rented modest rooms, sometimes near the medical faculty, sometimes wherever he could afford, and began his studies at the University of Buenos Aires with an energy that surprised even himself. Medicine was not merely a career choice. For him, it was an attempt to understand suffering at its most physical, most human level. He attended lectures by day, read philosophy by night, and wandered the city in between. Buenos Aires was entering the Perón era, a time of loud politics and working-class empowerment. Posters of Juan and Eva Perón appeared everywhere. Workers filled the streets. Radio spilled speeches from open windows. Ernesto listened, observed, and questioned. He rarely committed himself aloud to any political faction during these years, but he was collecting ideas the way some people collect stamps, carefully and obsessively. A well-known fact from this period is that he volunteered extensively at hospitals and leper colonies while still a student, particularly the San Pablo Leprosarium in northern Argentina. There, he witnessed patients pushed to the margins of society, not by disease alone, but by fear and neglect. One nurse later recalled that Ernesto refused to wear gloves when treating the patients, a gesture small in action but immense in symbolism. A lesser-known detail is that he kept a small notebook during these visits, not for medical notes, but for fragments of poetry and short reflections on loneliness, which he scribbled during lunch breaks. Despite his growing seriousness, he was not without humor. Friends described him as mischievous, sometimes blunt to the point of awkwardness, and often laughing at his own jokes before anyone else did. He enjoyed practical pranks, particularly on new students. Once, he filled a roommate's shoes with water and waited patiently for the morning reaction, nearly triggering an asthma attack from laughing too hard. Yet something restless lived inside him. Classrooms felt too narrow. Argentina felt too familiar. The world beyond its borders pulled at him like a magnet. In 1951, that restlessness finally found form. Ernesto and his close friend Alberto Granado mounted a battered motorcycle they affectionately named La Poderosa, the Mighty One, and set off across South America. The trip would last over 8 months and cover more than 8,000 kilometers. What began as youthful adventure quietly transformed into an emotional reckoning. They passed through Chile's copper mines, Peru's ancient ruins, Colombia's tense cities, and the Amazon's endless breadth. In each place, Ernesto saw patterns repeating. Workers exploited, indigenous communities ignored, governments distant, wealth concentrated in very few hands. He slept in peasant huts, hospital corridors, abandoned buildings, and once under a bridge beside a pack of stray dogs. Hunger became routine, discomfort became familiar, perspective became permanent. At the San Pablo leper colony in Peru, he again worked among patients, organizing football matches, medical treatments, and evening conversations by the river. On his 24th birthday, he swam across the Amazon to the side of the river reserved for those with leprosy, ignoring the risk and his asthma entirely. That moment, the dark water, the cheers, the moon, became one of the defining memories of his life. Historians still argue whether this journey created his revolutionary worldview or merely revealed convictions already forming within him. What is certain is that he returned to Argentina changed. The student who left had been curious. The man who returned was resolved. He finished medical school in 1953, earning his degree in dermatology and infectious disease. Yet even as he accepted his diploma, his mind was already elsewhere. He had seen too much suffering to imagine a quiet clinic life. He packed a single bag, hugged his parents, and began moving north again toward Guatemala. Toward history, toward the life that would consume him completely. When Ernesto crossed into Guatemala in late 1953, the air felt heavy with both heat and hope. The country was in the middle of an ambitious social experiment under President Jacobo Arbenz, who was attempting land reform, labor protections, and economic independence in a region long dominated by foreign companies and old elites. For Ernesto, this was not a theory from a book. This was politics breathing in front of him. He arrived with little money, a few medical supplies, and an open notebook. He slept on floors, worked odd medical jobs, and spent long evenings in cafes and boarding houses arguing about Marx, imperialism, and the future of Latin America with exiles, students, and revolutionaries from across the continent. A well-known fact is that it was in Guatemala that Ernesto began signing his letters simply as Che, adopting the Argentine expression he used constantly in conversation. A lesser-known detail from these months is that he tried briefly to make money by photographing street scenes and selling the prints to tourists. Though most of the rolls of film were ruined by humidity, it was also in Guatemala that he met Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist and political activist. Their relationship grew quickly, built on shared ideals and endless conversation. Hilda introduced him to deeper Marxist literature and broader revolutionary networks. He proposed to her with no ring, no ceremony, only a promise that their lives would never be ordinary. In 1954, the fragile Guatemalan dream collapsed. The United States government, alarmed by Arbenz's reforms and influenced by corporate interests, supported a covert operation that destabilized the government. Planes bombed Guatemala City. Propaganda flooded the streets. The army withdrew its support. Arbenz resigned. The reforms dissolved almost overnight. Ernesto witnessed it all. He watched civilians flee, saw the terror in hospitals, and helped treat the wounded while bombs echoed outside. When the new regime began arresting suspected leftists, he burned papers, hid comrades, and prepared to escape. He later wrote that Guatemala had taught him more about power than any university ever could. Historians still argue whether this moment was the true birth of his uncompromising revolutionary identity, but there is little doubt it hardened him. Idealism alone, he concluded, would never defeat entrenched power. After escaping Guatemala, Ernesto and Hilda fled to Mexico. There, in a small apartment filled with cigarette smoke and whispered plans, his life turned again. In July 1955, he was introduced to two Cuban brothers recently released from prison, Fidel and Raúl Castro. They spoke of overthrowing the dictator Fulgencio Batista and liberating Cuba. Ernesto listened all night. By morning, he had committed himself. He joined their group not as a doctor, but as a soldier. Training was brutal. He learned weapons, tactics, discipline. He also treated the injured, combining both roles naturally. The group lived under constant threat of arrest. When Mexican police finally raided them, Ernesto was captured, beaten, and briefly imprisoned. His asthma nearly killed him in his cell. Yet, when released, he returned immediately to the group. On November 25, 1956, 82 men crowded onto a small yacht named Grandma and sailed for Cuba. The crossing was miserable. Seasick, starving, soaked, they landed weeks behind schedule and were ambushed almost immediately. Most were killed or captured. Only about 20 survived. Ernesto was among them. They retreated into the Sierra Maestra mountains, wounded, exhausted, nearly defeated. It was there, in the jungle's slow breath and the quiet between gunshots, that Che Guevara's final transformation began. The Sierra Maestra mountains did not welcome them. Thick vines, sharp stone, constant rain, insects that never slept, everything about the jungle felt like a test of whether they truly belonged in this struggle. The surviving rebels moved carefully, hungry, often silent, learning the terrain one cautious step at a time. Ernesto, now fully known as Che among the group, carried both medical supplies and a rifle, shifting between healer and fighter as the situation demanded. At first, the group barely survived. They lacked food, weapons, even trust from local villagers who had been terrorized by Batista's forces for years and feared retaliation. Che treated peasants for free, curing infections, setting broken bones, and listening patiently to their stories. Slowly, trust grew. Entire families began slipping the rebels food at night, hiding them during patrols, sending sons to join the movement. One well-known historical fact from this period is that Fidel formally promoted Che to the rank of comandante in 1957, recognizing his leadership and discipline. A little-known detail remembered by several guerrillas is that Che insisted on nightly reading sessions in camp. After long marches and battles, exhausted fighters would sit around a small lantern while Che read aloud from books on history, economics, or even poetry. He believed a revolution should educate as well as liberate. Che's leadership style was strict and demanding. He enforced discipline without exception. Theft, cowardice, or betrayal were punished harshly. Yet he also worked harder than anyone, marching despite asthma attacks that left him gasping behind a tree, face pale, sweat soaking his shirt. He refused special treatment. When he collapsed, he recovered quietly and returned to the march without complaint. The rebels grew in strength. They sabotaged army supply lines, ambushed patrols, and seized weapons. Batista's soldiers, poorly motivated and badly led, began surrendering in growing numbers. Che's column became known for its effectiveness and its discipline. Villagers started calling them the bearded doctors of justice. Historians still argue whether Che's rigid moral code strengthened the revolution or planted seeds of future authoritarianism. What is clear is that his presence gave the movement both intellectual weight and operational precision. In late 1958, Che led a critical campaign westward toward the city of Santa Clara. The battle for Santa Clara became one of the decisive moments of the revolution. Using sabotage, psychological warfare, and daring strategy, Che's forces derailed an armored train carrying government reinforcements and supplies. The victory shattered Batista's remaining confidence. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. Havana awoke to a new era. Che entered the capital days later, thinner, quieter, his uniform worn and dusty. He moved into a small office in the former fortress of La Habana, which soon became a center of revolutionary justice. From there, he helped shape the newborn government. He was appointed head of the National Bank, despite joking that he had been chosen because someone misread his signature as Che instead of the Spanish word for economist. Later, he became Minister of Industries, responsible for reshaping Cuba's economy from the ground up. He worked long hours, often sleeping in his office, fueled by coffee and an almost frightening sense of duty. Yet the same man who had treated peasants in jungle huts now signed laws, organized factories, and negotiated with world powers. The transformation was complete. The mountain doctor had become one of the most powerful men in the Caribbean. Havana in 1959 moved like a city waking from a long fever. Music drifted from open windows, flags hung from balconies, murals appeared overnight. The revolution had won, but now came the far more complicated task of governing. Che stepped into this new phase of life with the same intensity he had carried through the jungle. Though the terrain had changed from mountains to ministries, he worked relentlessly. As head of the National Bank, he oversaw the rapid nationalization of industries and banks, signing Cuba's new currency with a simple Che. That signature alone became one of the most famous autographs in the world. A well-known fact is that he later became Minister of Industries, directing efforts to transform Cuba into a self-sufficient socialist economy. A lesser-known detail is that he personally inspected sugar mills and factories at night, sometimes sleeping on concrete floors beside the workers rather than returning to his office. Che believed that the new society required a new man, someone driven by moral duty rather than material reward. He cut his own salary, wore the same worn boots everywhere, and volunteered in cane fields on weekends. Photographs from the period show him sweating beside peasants under the Caribbean sun, laughing while carrying sacks of sugar. He expected the same sacrifice from others, often more than they were willing to give. His economic policies, however, faced enormous challenges. Cuba's dependence on sugar exports, U.S. trade embargoes, and the sudden need to restructure everything from agriculture to education created constant pressure. Che argued fiercely in cabinet meetings for industrialization and moral incentives over financial rewards. Historians still argue whether his economic vision was too idealistic for Cuba's realities, or whether external pressures made success impossible regardless of policy. On the international stage, Che became one of the revolution's most visible voices. In 1964, he addressed the United Nations in New York, condemning colonialism, racism, and global inequality. The speech was fiery, uncompromising, and deeply personal, yet those who traveled with him remembered quieter moments. Che standing alone at hotel windows late at night, staring at foreign cities, coughing softly, lost in thought. He also represented Cuba in meetings across Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. In Moscow, Prague, Algiers, and Beijing, he debated economics and revolution with world leaders. Despite his global presence, he remained uncomfortable with the routines of power. He disliked formal suits, endless protocols, and political maneuvering. His asthma worsened. His marriage to Elida March, whom he had met during the war, brought warmth and children into his life. But even family happiness could not quiet the restlessness that had followed him since youth. By 1965, Che was increasingly convinced that Cuba's revolution could not survive alone. He believed new revolutions were needed across the developing world to challenge global power structures. In a secret farewell letter to Fidel, he renounced his government posts and even his Cuban citizenship. He left behind his children, his home, and his public life. Disguised, nearly unrecognizable, he slipped out of Cuba toward Africa, chasing once more the same distant horizon that had pulled him from Argentina years before. Che arrived in the Congo in 1965 under an assumed name, his beard shaved, his familiar presence hidden beneath false papers and tired eyes. The tropical air was heavier than the Cuban jungle, thick with moisture and uncertainty. He had come to support revolutionary forces fighting the pro-Western government after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, believing Africa might become the next great front of global liberation. Reality struck quickly and without mercy. The local guerrilla forces were fragmented, poorly trained, and riddled with internal rivalries. Supplies were scarce, leadership was unstable, language barriers slowed everything. Che worked tirelessly to impose structure, training fighters by day and treating malaria and wounds by night. A well-known fact from this period is that Che personally led patrols into combat despite severe asthma and repeated illness. A lesser-known detail recorded in his private diaries is that he sometimes fed the fighters condensed milk mixed with sugar as a makeshift energy ration when proper food ran out. Morale deteriorated. Discipline collapsed. Entire units abandoned their positions. Che grew increasingly frustrated, writing bitterly about corruption, fear, and lack of commitment. Historians still argue whether the Congo mission was doomed by local conditions or by Che's inability to adapt his Cuban model to a very different political and cultural environment. By late 1965, the mission was clearly failing. Che ordered the remaining Cubans to withdraw. He returned secretly to Cuba, thinner, sicker, and more disillusioned than ever. But he did not stop. Within months, he was planning a new campaign in Bolivia. He believed South America's heartland could ignite continental revolution. He entered Bolivia in late 1966 using false documents, establishing a base camp in the remote Nancohuaza region. Once again, the pattern repeated: difficult terrain, unreliable local support, poor communication, growing isolation. Bolivian peasants were wary. Government forces, trained and assisted by U.S. advisors, closed in. Che's group struggled with hunger, sickness, and dwindling supplies. He continued writing in his diary, documenting every setback with painful honesty. In October 1967, his unit was surrounded in the ravine of Quebrada del Uro. During the battle, Che was wounded in the leg and his rifle was destroyed. He was captured alive. The next day, in the small schoolhouse of La Higuera, orders arrived from the Bolivian High Command. Che was executed. A final photograph taken after his death showed his body laid out, eyes open, calm, strangely peaceful. The image traveled the world, igniting legend, protest, grief, and fascination that would never fade. The man who had crossed continents chasing justice had reached the stillness at the end of the road. The fall of Batista in January 1959 did not feel like a finish line. For Che, it felt like the opening of a door into a far more complicated room. Havana was alive with celebration when the guerrillas entered the capital. People flooded the streets, climbed lampposts, draped flags from balconies. Old men cried openly. Young soldiers hugged strangers. Cars honked for hours without stopping. Che moved through the noise quietly, absorbing it all with an almost shy distance, as if he were watching someone else's victory unfold. Within days he was assigned to the former military fortress of La Cabana, overlooking Havana's harbor. It became one of the revolution's first centers of authority. From its stone corridors, Che oversaw the trials of officials from the previous regime accused of torture, corruption, and murder. This period remains one of the most debated chapters of his life. Historians still argue whether the revolutionary tribunals were necessary justice after years of brutality or the first step toward authoritarian excess. What is certain is that Che believed the new government could not survive if it carried the old crimes inside it. Despite the gravity of his role, small human habits followed him into power. A little-known detail remembered by secretaries at La Cabana is that Che kept a battered thermos of yerba mate beside him during hearings and would quietly refill the cup while witnesses spoke, as if conducting state business from a mountain campsite. In February 1959, he was formally declared a Cuban citizen by special decree, a rare honor, and soon afterward appointed head of the National Bank. Che later joked that the job came from a misunderstanding. When Fidel asked who among them was an economist, Che thought he had asked who was a communist, and raised his hand, yet he accepted the position with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. He immersed himself in economic planning, studying global trade, sugar markets, and industrial models late into the night. He slept little, smoked constantly, and kept working through asthma attacks that left him leaning over his desk, breathing slowly until the tightness passed. He believed the revolution would collapse without economic independence. In 1961, he became Minister of Industries. His days blurred into factory inspections, meetings, foreign delegations, speeches, and endless paperwork. He demanded sacrifice from himself and from everyone around him. He reduced his salary to the level of a skilled worker and publicly refused special privileges. On weekends, he volunteered in sugar fields, steel plants, and construction sites. Photographs of Che swinging a machete beside farmers became iconic, not staged for cameras but repeated again and again whenever work was needed. Yet the work was brutally hard. Cuba's economy struggled under U.S. embargoes, technical shortages, and sudden structural change. Che pushed for rapid industrialization and moral incentives over financial rewards, convinced that people could be motivated by collective purpose rather than money alone. Many agreed with him, many quietly doubted. Even his closest comrades sometimes feared he was asking too much of human nature. At home, life softened him slightly. His marriage to Elida March, whom he had met during the war, gave him a sense of steadiness. Their house was filled with children, books, laughter, and visitors from every corner of the revolutionary world. Yet even in these moments, Che often seemed restless, pacing the floor, coughing in the night, writing letters long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The victory had delivered him into power, but not into peace. As Che's responsibilities inside Cuba deepened, so did his presence beyond its borders. He had become, almost without trying, the international face of the Cuban Revolution, a symbol of defiance, discipline, and uncompromising belief. Wherever he traveled, crowds gathered not simply to see a government official, but to glimpse a man who seemed to live exactly as he spoke. In 1960 he began representing Cuba across the world. He visited Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Egypt, Algeria, Ghana, and many other nations navigating their own post-colonial futures. In Moscow, he negotiated trade agreements for oil and machinery. In Beijing, he debated development strategies. In Cairo, he spoke with leaders who had also defied old empires. A well-known historical fact is that in December 1964, Che addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York, delivering a speech that openly challenged U.S. foreign policy and condemned racism, colonialism, and nuclear threat. Behind the scenes, he remained deeply uncomfortable with diplomacy. He disliked luxury hotels, formal banquets, and political flattery. A lesser-known detail from this period is that he often skipped official dinners to walk alone through unfamiliar cities, sometimes coughing heavily in the cold night air, watching ordinary life continue beyond the walls of power. Che's economic ideas continued to evolve. He criticized both Western capitalism and what he saw as moral stagnation inside some socialist systems. He believed true revolution required personal transformation, not merely new institutions. Historians still argue whether his vision of the new man was realistic inspiration or impossible idealism. Inside Cuba, pressures mounted. Industrial goals were difficult to meet. Agricultural production fluctuated. International tensions sharpened, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world frighteningly close to nuclear war. Che grew increasingly dissatisfied with bureaucracy and compromise. He felt the revolution had become too comfortable. By 1965, he made a decision that stunned even his closest allies. In a private letter to Fidel Castro, later read publicly, Che renounced his government positions, military rank, and even his Cuban citizenship. He wrote that other lands of the world called for his modest efforts. He left behind his children, his home, and his public identity, convinced that his role lay once again in the field rather than the office. He vanished from public view. Rumors spread across continents. Some believed he was dead. Others claimed he had gone mad. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Che was already on the move again, chasing the same restless horizon that had carried him from Argentina so many years before. The plane touched down in Central Africa under a different name, with different papers, and with almost nothing that connected the man stepping onto the runway to the famous figure the world had known. Che had erased himself on purpose. His beard was gone, his hair trimmed, his voice quieter. Only the eyes remained the same. The Congo was his destination. It was 1965, and the young nation was in chaos after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Various factions fought for control, while foreign interests pressed from every direction. Che believed the continent could become a new front in the struggle against imperial power, a place where global inequality might finally be confronted head. He entered the jungle with a small group of Cuban fighters, determined to train local rebels and build a revolutionary force, but nothing unfolded as he had imagined. The terrain was brutal, the climate relentless. Communication between groups was poor, leadership fractured, discipline evaporated. Fighters disappeared for days without explanation. Weapons failed. Food spoiled. Illness spread. A well-known historical fact from this campaign is that Che kept a detailed diary documenting the mission's collapse. A lesser-known detail from those pages is that he sometimes boiled leaves and roots into a bitter tea for the men when proper food ran out, encouraging them to drink by promising it would strengthen their lungs even as his own asthma worsened. Che grew increasingly frustrated, not with the idea of revolution, but with the reality of it in this environment. He wrote of corruption, fear, superstition, and the crushing difficulty of creating unity where none existed. Historians still argue whether the Congo mission failed because of Che's leadership, local conditions, or international interference. But by late 1965, even Che could no longer deny the mission was lost. He ordered a withdrawal. Within months, he was planning again. This time, he chose Bolivia, the geographical heart of South America. He believed that if revolution could ignite there, it might spread across the continent. In late 1966, he entered Bolivia under another false identity and established a base camp in the remote Nankawaza region. Once more the pattern repeated: isolation, hunger, sickness, dwindling supplies, unreliable local support. The Bolivian army, advised by U.S. intelligence, closed in slowly and methodically. Peasants were afraid. Messages failed. Reinforcements never arrived. Che's health deteriorated. His asthma attacks became more frequent. His diary entries grew shorter, more strained, but his resolve never weakened. On October 8, 1967, in the ravine of Quebrada del Uro, Che was wounded in the leg during an ambush. His rifle was destroyed. He was captured alive. That night he sat on a schoolhouse bench in the village of La Higuera, hands tied, coughing in the dark. The next afternoon he was executed. The photograph of Che Guevara's body, taken shortly after his execution in La Higuera, became one of the most recognizable images in modern history. He lay on a simple wooden bench, eyes open, expression calm, almost indifferent to the world that had hunted him. Soldiers posed him deliberately for the camera, unaware that the photograph would ignite decades of fascination, debate, and myth-making. It was a quiet, final moment, yet it spoke louder than the guns and jungles of his life ever could. The news spread slowly at first, carried by whispers through Latin American villages, then by radio, then by international newspapers. For many it was the end of a man, for others the birth of a symbol. His name was shouted in protests, printed on posters, worn on t-shirts, and painted on walls. A well-known fact is that the image by Alberto Cuba, known as Guerrillero Heroico, became the face of rebellion worldwide. A lesser-known detail is that the original negative was buried for years, only resurfacing after being preserved secretly in Havana, a relic that survived censorship, decay, and political turmoil. Che's death did not erase his influence. Ideas he had carried across continents, social justice, anti-imperialism, moral discipline, and revolutionary transformation continued to inspire activists, thinkers, and ordinary people long after he was gone. Historians still argue whether his strategies were practical models or symbolic gestures, but few dispute the lasting emotional and cultural impact. In Bolivia, small villages remember him in local songs and stories. In Cuba, schools teach his writings alongside poems and history lessons. In Africa and Latin America, guerrilla groups cited him as inspiration, even as they faced the same logistical and human challenges he had confronted. His diaries, speeches, and letters were studied for both their moral passion and their tactical insights. Yet behind the myth, the man had been remarkably human. He was prone to exhaustion, haunted by asthma, sometimes tender, sometimes irritable, always deeply introspective. He loved poetry, music, children, and quiet moments by a river or mountain. He wrote letters that revealed vulnerability, doubt, and humor, often to his family, sometimes to himself. These glimpses remind us that the revolutionary figure was also a man with fears, hopes, and private tenderness. Che's life had spanned continents, conflicts, and ideas. He began as a sickly child in Argentina, wandered across Latin America, fought in Cuba's mountains, shaped a government, traveled the globe, and finally died in a small Bolivian village. His story demonstrates the heights of human determination, the intensity of conviction, and the enduring question of how ideals survive in the face of harsh reality. Even now, more than 50 years later, the debate continues. Was he a visionary, a symbol, a hero, or a cautionary tale? Perhaps he was all of these at once, leaving behind a life that refuses to be neatly summarized, lingering instead in memory, debate, and the slow, steady rhythm of history itself. As we settle into the quiet after Che Guevara's life, imagine the soft rustle of leaves in the Sierra Maestra, the gentle murmur of Havana's streets, or the distant rush of a river in Bolivia. His journey began with fragile lungs and a restless curiosity, and it carried him across continents, through fire and rain, through the laughter of children and the shouts of battle. There is a rhythm to it all, a pattern of human striving and relentless movement that slowly draws to rest. He was a man of paradoxes, tender yet strict, idealistic yet uncompromising, restless yet capable of stillness in private reflection. He walked among the poorest, argued with the most powerful, and even in moments of extreme danger, he paused to notice the small things, a bird in the jungle, a handwritten note, the taste of simple bread. His life reminds us that courage is not always loud, and that conviction often requires both suffering and careful observation. In the end, the legend is inseparable from the man. His name travels through decades, through streets and posters, classrooms and novels, photographs and songs. Yet the most lasting image may not be the iconic photograph, but the quiet boy with asthma reading under a tree, dreaming of a world larger than his own. Every choice, every hardship, every step through mountains and cities was guided by that early sense of fairness, curiosity, and determination. As the night deepens and the world outside your window slows, imagine the spaces he walked, the still moments between action, the places where history whispered around him. Let the story settle gently in your mind, not as a call to arms, but as a reflection on a life lived fully, with passion, complexity, and unwavering attention to what mattered most to him. The mountains are silent now, the streets calm, the pages closed, and yet, somewhere, a faint echo of footsteps remains, a reminder that even the most restless of lives can leave a serene trace in the quiet of the world.